In the fall of 2012, coach Mark Reynolds appeared to have everything he could ever want. At 45 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades building a respectable career as the head coach of the Raleigh Community College basketball team. Situated in the bustling heart of Raleigh, North Carolina, the college wasn't known for producing top-tier athletes, but under Mark's guidance, the team had become a local powerhouse. He was well respected by his peers and admired by his players for his dedication and unwavering commitment to the sport. Mark's reputation as a coach was built on his ability to develop raw talent and turn average players into formidable competitors. Mark's personal life mirrored his professional success. He was married to Karen, a 42-year-old school psychologist known for her empathetic approach and dedication to her students. The couple had one son, Jacob, a 16-year-old who, unlike his father, showed little interest in sports. Instead, Jacob spent most of his time engrossed in the digital world of computer games, a hobby that Mark struggled to understand but ultimately tolerated. The Reynolds family lived in a modest, well-kept home in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Raleigh, a place where everyone knew each other and life moved at a comfortable, predictable pace. Mark's daily routine was a carefully balanced act of managing his responsibilities as a coach and maintaining the appearance of a devoted family man. He woke up early every morning, heading to the gym before the sun rose, where he would spend hours crafting strategies, reviewing game footage, and planning drills for his players. By the time his team arrived for practice, Mark was already several steps ahead, his mind buzzing with ways to push them harder, to make them better. In the evenings, he would return home, often late, tired but satisfied with a day spent doing what he loved. His interactions with Karen and Jacob were brief and functional. Discussions about schedules, school events, and the occasional family outing. Though Mark loved his family, his true passion lay on the basketball court. In September of that year, the dynamics of Mark's life began to shift with the arrival of a new player, Chris Lawson. Chris was a 20-year-old transfer student from a small town in Georgia. He had moved to Raleigh to escape the limitations of his hometown and pursue a fresh start. Standing at 6 feet 4 inches, with a lean, athletic build and an impressive wingspan, Chris quickly caught the attention of everyone on the team. But it wasn't just his physical attributes that set him apart. It was his raw talent. Chris had an instinctive understanding of the game, a natural ability to read plays, and an almost preternatural agility on the court that made him a formidable player. Mark, who had seen countless players come and go, recognized something special in Chris, something that reminded him of his own younger self, a mixture of potential and determination that was rare and invaluable. The first time Mark saw Chris play, he was struck by a sense of déjà vu. Watching Chris maneuver the ball with precision and grace, Mark was transported back to his own youth, a time when he had been a rising star with dreams of making it big. Life had taken him down a different path, but seeing Chris reignited a long-dormant fire in Mark. He saw in Chris an opportunity to mentor someone who could achieve what he hadn't, a chance to shape a prodigy. Eager to develop Chris's potential, Mark began to offer him extra training sessions. These weren't just about improving Chris's skills. They were about imparting the wisdom Mark had accumulated over the years, teaching him the nuances of the game that only experience could provide. Mark justified these one-on-one sessions as necessary for Chris's development, but deep down, he knew there was more to it. Chris represented something Mark hadn't found in his own son, a shared passion for basketball, a drive to succeed, and a connection to the sport that Jacob had never understood. As the weeks passed, these training sessions became more frequent, and the relationship between Mark and Chris grew stronger. Mark found himself looking forward to their time together, more than he would have admitted. He began to invest not just in Chris's athletic performance, but in his personal life as well. Mark would ask about Chris's background, his life before Raleigh, his hopes and dreams. Chris, who had initially been reserved, started to open up, revealing a life marked by hardship and a desire to prove himself. His father had been absent for most of his childhood, and his mother had struggled to make ends meet. Basketball had been his escape, his way of carving out a place in the world. Mark's growing attachment to Chris didn't go unnoticed. His assistant coaches began to remark on the amount of time Mark was spending with the young player, though their comments were made in jest. with no real suspicion. Karen, however, sensed something was off. She had noticed the changes in Mark. He was more distant at home, often distracted and less engaged with the family. Whenever she tried to talk to him about it, he brushed off her concerns, attributing his behavior to the stress of the upcoming basketball season. But Karen wasn't convinced. She had seen this kind of behavior before in her work, signs of a person grappling with emotions they didn't fully understand or couldn't express. Despite her growing unease, Karen decided to give Mark space, hoping that whatever was bothering him would resolve itself. She focused on her work and on Jacob, who was becoming more withdrawn as the school year progressed. Mark, oblivious to the tension building at home, continued to pour his energy into coaching, particularly in his sessions with Chris. He rationalized his actions as part of his duty as a coach, but the truth was that his feelings for Chris were becoming more complex, more confusing. He was crossing lines he didn't even realize existed. And as the season progressed, Mark's carefully constructed life began to unravel in ways he could never have anticipated. As October 2012 unfolded, the once clear boundaries between Coach Mark Reynolds and his star player, Chris Lawson, began to blur. The one-on-one training sessions, initially intended to sharpen Chris's basketball skills, became increasingly frequent and extended well beyond their scheduled times. Mark found himself lingering at the gym long after everyone else had left, offering Chris tips and strategies that went beyond the ordinary scope of coaching. He was captivated by Chris's raw talent, but it was more than just admiration for an athlete's potential. It was a deep, almost obsessive interest that he couldn't quite explain. Mark's fixation on Chris was not purely professional. At first, he told himself that he was merely filling the void left by Jacob, his 16-year-old son, who showed no interest in sports. Jacob was a typical teenager, more engrossed in his computer games than in the world around him. This had long been a source of quiet disappointment for Mark, who had always dreamed of sharing his passion for basketball with his son. But now in Chris, he saw a chance to connect with someone who understood that passion, someone who could reciprocate the energy and dedication that Mark had devoted to the sport for years. As Mark's thoughts became increasingly consumed by Chris, his behavior at home began to change. He would come home later than usual, often distracted and emotionally distant. Karen, his wife, was the first to notice these changes. A seasoned psychologist, Karen had spent years helping troubled students navigate their personal issues, and she recognized the signs of a man struggling with something internal. Mark's usually predictable routine had become erratic. He was no longer the attentive husband she had known for years. He would barely speak to her during dinner, his mind clearly elsewhere, and the warm, intimate conversations they once shared had dwindled into short, terse exchanges. Karen's concern grew with each passing day. She attempted to engage Mark, asking about his day, his work, and how the team was doing. But Mark's responses were vague and perfunctory. He would say that everything was fine, that he was just tired, or that the upcoming games were weighing on him. Karen wasn't convinced. She could sense that something deeper was troubling him, something that he wasn't willing to share. Her attempts to probe further only led to tension between them, culminating in arguments that left both feeling frustrated and unheard. The turning point came one evening in mid-October, when Mark returned home even later than usual. He was visibly tense, his face drawn with a mixture of anxiety and something Karen couldn't quite place. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. Karen had been waiting for him, and as soon as he walked through the door, she confronted him. The argument that followed was one of their worst. Karen demanded to know what was going on, accusing Mark of neglecting his family and hiding something from her. She spoke of how distant he had become, how their once solid marriage seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. Mark, caught off guard and already emotionally drained, lashed out in return. He accused Karen of being paranoid, of overreacting, and insisted that his focus on Chris was purely professional. But Karen knew better. She had seen this kind of behavior before in her work, people wrestling with emotions they didn't understand, denying them until they couldn't anymore. She tried to reason with Mark, to get him to open up, but he refused. He couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge the growing attachment he felt for Chris, an attachment that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The more Karen pushed, the more defensive Mark became, and the argument ended with Mark storming out of the room, leaving Karen feeling helpless and alone. Meanwhile, Mark's interactions with Chris had taken on a new, more personal tone. During their training sessions, Mark began to share stories from his own youth, tales of his glory days as a player, and the opportunities he had missed. Chris listened, sometimes responding with his own experiences, but more often than not, he simply absorbed Mark's words, perhaps sensing that his coach needed someone to confide in. Mark began to see in Chris not just a talented player, but a kindred spirit, someone who understood the sacrifices and struggles of pursuing greatness. This growing bond, however, was not without its complications. Mark found himself thinking about Chris at odd moments, during meetings, at home with Karen and Jacob, even late at night when he couldn't sleep. He was confused by the intensity of his feelings, feelings that went beyond the typical coach-player relationship. It wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about something more, something that made Mark uncomfortable and guilty. He knew he was crossing lines, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. The tension at home continued to escalate. Karen, sensing that something was seriously wrong, became more insistent in her attempts to get Mark to open up. She pleaded with him to talk to her, to tell her what was going on. But Mark, overwhelmed by his own internal conflict, shut her out. Their arguments became more frequent and more heated, creating a rift that neither of them knew how to bridge. As October drew to a close, Mark was a man on the edge. He was torn between his responsibilities as a husband and father and the growing, inexplicable connection he felt with Chris. His once stable life was beginning to unravel, and he had no idea how to stop it. The boundaries that had once seemed so clear between coach and player, between professional and personal, were now blurred beyond recognition. Mark was standing on a dangerous ground, and he was beginning to realize that one wrong step could send everything crashing down. By late November 2012, Mark Reynolds' life was spiraling out of control. The tension at home had reached a boiling point, with arguments between him and Karen becoming almost a nightly occurrence. Mark's focus on Chris Lawson had become an obsession, one that Karen could no longer ignore. Their once loving marriage had turned into a battlefield, with Karen demanding answers and Mark retreating further into his own conflicted thoughts. One particularly cold evening, after another heated exchange with Karen about his distant behavior and late nights, Mark's phone rang. It was Chris, and his voice on the other end of the line was strained and full of despair. Chris had just been dumped by his girlfriend, a relationship that, unbeknownst to Mark, had been one of the few stable things in the young man's life since moving to Raleigh. The breakup had left Chris devastated, and in his vulnerable state, he turned to the only person he felt could offer him solace, his coach. Chris's plea for help was desperate. He didn't know where else to turn, and his voice shook as he asked Mark to meet him at a park nearby. Mark didn't hesitate. Despite the unresolved argument with Karen, despite the growing unease in his own mind, he felt an almost uncontrollable urge to be there for Chris. It was as if he was being pulled by a force he couldn't resist, a force that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Mark arrived at the park, the cold air biting at his skin as he made his way through the dimly lit paths. He spotted Chris sitting on a bench, his head in his hands, clearly distressed. Mark approached cautiously, his own heart pounding as he sat down beside him. Chris didn't look up at first. He was too consumed by his own sorrow. When he finally did, his eyes were red-rimmed, his face streaked with tears. The sight of Chris so vulnerable hit Mark hard. He felt an overwhelming sense of protectiveness, a need to comfort the young man who had come to mean so much to him. Chris began to talk, his words tumbling out in a rush. He spoke of the breakup, of how lost he felt, and how nothing seemed to make sense anymore. He confessed that he didn't know how to move forward, that the pain was unbearable. Mark listened intently, his own emotions churning. He wanted to say the right things, to offer words of encouragement and support, but he found himself struggling. The lines between coach and player, mentor and friend, had blurred beyond recognition. In an attempt to console Chris, Mark placed a reassuring arm around his shoulder. What should have been a simple gesture of comfort carried an intensity that neither of them expected. Mark felt a surge of emotions, sympathy, protectiveness, and something else, something deeper and more troubling. The warmth of Chris's body against his own triggered a response that Mark had been trying to suppress for weeks. Overcome by a mix of emotions, guilt, confusion, and an undeniable physical attraction, Mark acted on impulse. He leaned in, his movements almost involuntary, and attempted to kiss Chris. The moment was fleeting, but it felt like an eternity to Mark. Chris, shocked and bewildered, recoiled immediately. His eyes widened in disbelief as he pushed Mark away with force. For a second, they both froze, the reality of what had just happened hanging heavily between them. Chris didn't say a word. The look on his face, part confusion, part fear, was enough to shatter whatever illusion Mark had built in his mind. Chris quickly stood up, taking several steps back before turning and running off into the night, leaving Mark alone on the bench, staring after him in stunned silence. The weight of what he had done hit Mark like a freight train. He had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. The gravity of his actions, the betrayal of the trust Chris had placed in him, was overwhelming. He sat there for several minutes, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. But there was no rationalizing it, no excuse that could justify what he had just done. When Mark finally made his way back home, he was in a daze. His mind replayed the scene over and over again, each time more painful than the last. He barely registered Karen's voice as she tried to engage him in yet another conversation about their strained relationship. He muttered a few incoherent words before heading straight to bed, where he lay awake, tormented by guilt and shame. Sleep eventually came, but it was restless and filled with dark, confusing dreams. That night marked the beginning of the end for Mark Reynolds. The boundaries he had once respected, both in his professional and personal life, had crumbled. What had started as a desire to mentor a promising young player had evolved into something far more dangerous. And now, with the lines crossed and the damage done, Mark was left to face the consequences of his actions. Consequences that would soon come crashing down on him with devastating force. The morning of November 28, 2012, dawned with a sense of foreboding for Mark Reynolds. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on his mind, but he tried to push them aside as he went about his routine. However, any attempt at normalcy was shattered when his phone buzzed with a message that sent a chill down his spine. It was from Chris Lawson, and its contents were nothing short of a bombshell. The message was direct and menacing. Chris demanded that Mark resign from his position as the college basketball coach immediately. He also insisted on a large sum of money as compensation for his silence. The implied threat was clear. If Mark didn't comply, Chris would go public with the incident from the night before. Chris knew full well what the revelation would mean. Mark's career would be destroyed, his reputation in tatters, and his personal life, already strained, would be obliterated. Mark's hands trembled as he read and reread the message, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Panic set in quickly. He could lose everything: his job, his family, his entire life as he knew it. The thought of public humiliation and the irreversible damage it would cause was unbearable. He couldn't let that happen, but he also knew that Chris had him backed into a corner. There was no easy way out. Desperate to find a solution, Mark agreed to meet Chris later that day, hoping against hope that he could somehow defuse the situation. They arranged to meet at a secluded spot, far from the eyes of anyone who might recognize them. Mark knew he had to approach this carefully. Any misstep could push Chris to make good on his threat. The tension was palpable as Mark approached the meeting spot, a quiet, deserted area near the edge of town. Chris was already there, waiting. His demeanor was cold and detached, a stark contrast to the vulnerable young man Mark had comforted just hours earlier. The transformation in Chris's attitude was jarring, and it put Mark on edge. Mark tried to reason with Chris, pleading with him to reconsider. He offered to help Chris in other ways, to support him through his tough time. But Chris was unmoved. His demands were firm: resignation and money, or he would ruin Mark's life. The conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument as both men's emotions boiled over. Mark, usually calm and composed, felt the walls closing in on him. The pressure of the situation, the fear of losing everything, and the betrayal he felt from Chris's blackmail combined into a potent mix of desperation and anger. In a moment of blind rage and fear, Mark snapped. He struck Chris with a powerful punch to the head, fueled by all the anxiety and frustration that had been building inside him. Chris staggered backward, losing his balance, and fell hard onto the pavement. The sickening sound of his head hitting the ground snapped Mark out of his haze. Time seemed to freeze as Mark watched in horror, his breath catching in his throat. For a few agonizing seconds, Mark stood paralyzed, unable to process what had just happened. Then, as if in a trance, he rushed to Chris's side. Chris was still breathing, but he was unconscious, his head bleeding from where it had struck the pavement. Panic surged through Mark's body as he knelt beside Chris, his mind racing with what to do next. He knew he had to act quickly. Mark shook Chris, trying to rouse him, but there was no response. The realization that Chris was severely injured, possibly dying, sent Mark into a full-blown panic. He checked Chris's pulse. It was weak but still there. Relief was fleeting, though, as Mark's thoughts immediately turned to the consequences. If Chris died, Mark knew he'd be facing far more than just public shame. He'd be facing prison. In a last-ditch effort to salvage the situation, Mark leaned over Chris's limp body and whispered a threat. He told Chris that he had no evidence, no proof, and that if he ever spoke about what had happened, Mark would make sure it ended even worse for him next time. It was a hollow threat, driven by desperation, but Mark clung to it as his only lifeline. Without waiting to see if Chris would wake up, Mark fled the scene. His heart pounded in his chest as he drove away, the reality of what he had done crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He didn't know if Chris would survive, but he knew one thing for sure. There was no going back now. The situation had spiraled far beyond his control, and the consequences, whatever they might be, were inevitable. As Mark returned home that night, the enormity of his actions consumed him. He could barely face Karen, who sensed something was deeply wrong, but received only silence in return. Mark's mind was a storm of fear, guilt, and denial as he prayed that somehow, miraculously, this nightmare would end without destroying his life completely. But the storm was just beginning, and Mark was about to learn that some actions have consequences that cannot be outrun, no matter how desperately one tries. On the morning of November 29, 2012, Mark Reynolds awoke to the sound of loud knocking on his front door. He had barely slept the previous night, haunted by the events that had transpired and the fear that they would soon catch up to him. As he opened the door, he was met by two uniformed police officers, their expressions stern and unyielding. Without hesitation, they informed him that he was under arrest for the assault of Chris Lawson, who had died from his injuries overnight. The shock of hearing Chris was dead sent Mark's world spiraling. He barely registered the officers reading him his rights as they handcuffed him and led him out of the house. His mind was racing, trying to comprehend how everything had gone so terribly wrong in such a short span of time. As they placed him in the back of the squad car, Mark couldn't shake the image of Chris lying on the pavement, the blood pooling around his head. He had hoped, prayed, that Chris would survive, that somehow this nightmare would end without the ultimate consequence. At the police station, Mark was subjected to hours of questioning. The detectives laid out the evidence against him, messages on Chris's phone, the records of their meetings, and the fact that Chris had told friends about the troubling relationship with his coach. Every piece of evidence pointed directly to Mark. With the weight of the situation bearing down on him and no way to deny his involvement, Mark finally broke down and confessed. He admitted to the altercation, detailing how the argument had escalated and how he had struck Chris in a moment of uncontrollable rage. He insisted that he never intended to kill Chris, that it was a tragic accident, but his confession only served to solidify the case against him. As the confession was recorded, Mark's thoughts drifted to Karen and Jacob. He wondered how they would cope with the scandal, how they would survive the shame and the media frenzy that would undoubtedly follow. He felt a deep pang of guilt for what he had done to his family, knowing that he had destroyed the life they had built together. The situation took a bizarre and unexpected turn when a few hours later, Karen arrived at the police station. Her face was pale, her expression one of determination mixed with despair. She demanded to speak with the detectives handling Mark's case. What she said next stunned everyone in the room. Karen confessed to being the one who had actually killed Chris Lawson. She revealed that she had followed Mark to the park that night, Suspecting something was wrong after weeks of observing his strange behavior and the late-night training sessions with Chris. She had watched from a distance as the argument between Mark and Chris unfolded. When she saw Mark strike Chris and the young man fall to the ground, something inside her snapped. In her confession, Karen described how she had waited until Mark fled the scene, consumed with guilt and fear. Overwhelmed by her own emotions, anger, betrayal, and a sense of losing control, Karen had driven her car towards Chris, who was lying unconscious on the pavement. She claimed that she hadn't planned to kill him, but in a fit of rage, unable to control her actions, she hit him with the car, ensuring that he wouldn't survive to ruin their lives any further. Karen's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation. The detectives were left to piece together the conflicting accounts in the timeline of events. While Mark's confession had already implicated him in Chris's death, Karen's admission complicated matters further. The detectives were now faced with the possibility that both Mark and Karen had played a role in the tragic events that led to Chris Lawson's death. As the day wore on, the police worked to corroborate Karen's story. They examined the damage to her car, analyzed surveillance footage from nearby cameras, and re-interviewed witnesses who had seen the altercation from a distance. The evidence seemed to support parts of Karen's account, but it also raised questions about whether her actions had been premeditated or driven by a sudden, uncontrollable impulse. Meanwhile, Mark was left to grapple with the devastating realization that his wife had been willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their family, even if it meant taking a life. He felt a mix of emotions: sorrow, guilt, and a deep sense of responsibility for the chain of events that had led to this point. The image of Karen striking Chris with the car played over and over in his mind, a haunting reminder of the irreversible damage that had been done. The case against both Mark and Karen was complicated and murky, with layers of intent and culpability that would take months to unravel. The legal proceedings that followed would be long and grueling as the truth of what happened that night slowly came to light. But one thing was certain: the lives of Mark, Karen, and everyone connected to them had been irrevocably altered. The consequences of their actions would ripple through their lives, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The trial began on March 15, 2013, in the wake of a media frenzy that had captivated Raleigh and much of the nation. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and those who had followed the case closely since the arrest of Mark and Karen Reynolds. The once respected coach and his wife now stood accused of a crime that had shocked their community, a crime that the prosecution argued was far more sinister than it initially appeared. The prosecution painted a damning picture of the events leading up to Chris Lawson's death. They argued that Mark and Karen had conspired together, driven by a desperate need to silence Chris before he could expose the inappropriate relationship Mark had initiated. According to the prosecution, the couple had coordinated their actions on that fateful night, with Mark luring Chris to the park under the pretense of offering comfort, while Karen followed closely behind, waiting for the right moment to strike. The prosecution asserted that Karen's confession, though appearing to be an act of remorse, was actually a calculated move designed to protect her husband from the full extent of the law. To support their theory, the prosecution presented a wealth of evidence: text messages between Mark and Karen on the night of the incident, indicating that they had communicated just before the altercation; forensic analysis of Karen's car, which showed deliberate impact marks consistent with striking a person; and testimony from experts who argued that the couple's actions demonstrated clear intent to kill. The prosecution also highlighted Mark's initial confession, emphasizing his acknowledgement of the altercation and his awareness of the potential consequences of striking Chris. The defense, on the other hand, argued that both Mark and Karen had acted out of intense emotional distress rather than premeditated intent. They portrayed Mark as a man who had lost control in a moment of panic, overwhelmed by the fear of losing everything he had worked for. Karen, they argued, had been driven to the brink by her husband's betrayal and the shock of witnessing the violent altercation. The defense claimed that Karen's actions were not part of a coordinated plan, but rather a spontaneous act of desperation by a woman pushed beyond her limits. As the trial progressed, the jury was presented with conflicting narratives, each compelling in its own right. The courtroom was tense as witnesses were called to testify, including friends and colleagues of the Reynolds family who spoke to the couple's character. as well as experts who provided insight into the psychological state of both Mark and Karen at the time of the crime. On April 28, 2013, after weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson stood to deliver the decision. Mark Reynolds was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury determined that while Mark had not intended to kill Chris, his actions had directly contributed to the young man's death, and his subsequent involvement in the cover-up warranted a severe penalty. Mark was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the court's view of his culpability in the tragic events. Karen Reynolds, however, faced a much harsher fate. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder, concluding that her decision to strike Chris with her car had been premeditated and calculated. The court deemed her actions as a part of a deliberate attempt to eliminate a threat to her family, rather than an impulsive act of passion. As a result, Karen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing brought a sense of finality to the trial, but it also left a deep sense of sorrow and loss in its wake. Jacob Reynolds, who had been a silent presence throughout the proceedings, sat alone in the courtroom as the verdict was read. His once stable life had been shattered, his parents now facing years, if not a lifetime, behind bars. The reality of his situation hit him with full force as he realized that the family he had known was gone forever.